Hello and welcome to another episode of edJEWcation. We play around with the sort of configurations of who shows up as hosts, and usually Jay is the steady one, but somehow this week we're doing it ourselves without Jay.
It's funny that you mention that because there have been times when you cut me out.
I know.
You don't mention that.
Those are the most popular episodes.
Yeah, I'm sure they are. It's lucky that my friend Rabbi Dovid Eliezrie is on, so you let me on here today.
That's what I'm really here for.
Usually when you're interviewing somebody like embarrassed to have me on, I'm going to ask him a tough question or something like that because you guys are.
Well, you gave away already who our esteemed guest is, but we are very happy today to be joined with not only a dear friend of yours, but my teacher. Do you remember that you taught me in high school? I don't know if you remember.
He wants to forget it.
I taught you his history, and they fired me because I didn't do the final exam. I was the only guy who didn't give a final. It was the only time I was fired in my life.
He got his gray hair from? His gray hair is from the Hebrew Academy and his congregation. I know his congregation. That's half his gray hair.
Exactly. So we are here with Rabbi Dovid Eliezrie, who is the Rabbi Director of Chabad in Yorba Linda, Beth Mayer.
No, North County.
North County? Sorry. I'm sorry I didn't get it right.
How
do you describe yourself?
We describe it officially as Chabad Beth Mayer Cohen Yorba Linda.
There you go.
Okay.
Yorba Linda. I was right.
But it's more than just Yorba Linda.
Okay.
It's really, he covers a lot of he covers a lot of territory from Anaheim to La Habra, from Corona to
quiet.
Yeah, good. Well, and how long have you been there?
We've been in Orange County, about 40 years. We've been in Yorba Linda about 36. It's about 41, 42 years in Orange County and about 36 years in Yorba Linda. We first came to Anaheim and then we moved here.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Now, but you guys know each other from even before then, correct?
Right. We were classmates way back early in our careers. It says in the Talmud, kids when you sit in them small, we always knew that Rabbi Eliezrie is going to go on to something big because he was always already the leader and the big mouth in the class. Rabbi Stein used to chase him around with his stick, in fourth grade. So we knew, but
we had a little juvenile experience together. We were in the same class with the same teacher. And of course, I was the star student, and he was in the back of the class constantly, most of the time in the principal's office.
But you lived in Montreal for how long, David?
We worked it out.
How long did you?
How long? What?
How long did you live in Montreal for?
I lived in Montreal about 2.5 years. My family moved from LA to Montreal because my father got a job as a sociologist, and I ended up living literally down the block from the Chabad Yeshiva. And I had gone to a modern Orthodox day school in Los Angeles, Hillel Hebrew Academy, which I am an alumnus of Hillel. Oh. And then Chabad was down the block, so I ended up sitting next to you in the classroom. The challenge was the language of instruction was Yiddish, and my Yiddish was all I knew was the words oy vey. So they put me a little bit in the lower grade for a little bit. I had to work things out. With the English, I was fine, but with the Yiddish, I was, I was challenged, linguistically challenged. And that was in the country, in Quebec, where they wanted to be also, French. So, and I was there for 2.5 years, and my family moved in 1968 to Israel.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So you
spent 5.5 years. Did you go to high school
in Israel or Montreal?
I went to yeshiva in Israel, and I thought when I arrived that the yeshiva was also a high school, but I got a little bit of a surprise when I arrived that there was no 2 years of secular education. But you can be educated in an autodidactic way. And so I am, as I told some recent graduates from Harvard, I went to yeshiva. They gave me a much better education than Harvard.
That's true.
That's for sure. That's for sure.
So I want to start off with a question about one of the reasons we have you here. There's many reasons, but one of them, the main one, is because you just wrote a second book that I have read called Undaunted. How the Sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneersohn, saved Russian Jewry. And then it goes on. But this book, how long have you been working on this book? Let's start with that.
4 years. It was 4 years of hard work. Coming in every morning at 6 and working on it for 3-4 hours a day.
Really?
It was a lot of work, a lot of research, and a lot of original research.
Right. Yeah, I have questions about that. But why this topic? What made you decide to write a book about the Sixth Chabad
It was a
Rebbe?
combination. I think it was a combination of three things. The first thing is I was always fascinated by the story of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe who passed away. He was born in 1880 and passed away in 1950. It was a story of courage. It was a heroic story. And I was always fascinated with that story. The second thing is, there's a saying by Hasidim that your spiritual birthday is the first time you come to visit the Rebbe. When I was about 14 years old, maybe 15, the custom was, and I think Rabbi Perlmutter remembers this, they would take the kids, and the teenage kids would be taken on the Yud Shvat, which is the anniversary of the passing of the previous Rebbe. They would go to New York, and they would also have a private audience, a group of kids with the Rebbe. And the first time I came to the Rebbe was Yud Shvat, the 10th of Shvat, probably around 1965 or 66. I don't remember which year exactly. And I was a young teenage kid. And so I felt this kind of connection to that date. And the third thing was I always write the book, but I didn't have the resources.
What is that date? What is that date, David? David.
Yud Shvat is the 10th of Shvat, is the anniversary of the passing of the Rebbe, of the 10th day of the Jewish month of Shvat, which comes out every year in January.
I know that, you know that, but our listeners don't know that.
It comes out every year in January. So you went from a lot of snow in Montreal to a little bit less snow in New York. And, I was captured by that whole experience. And then I had written this first book, The Secret of Chabad, that did very well. And I wanted to write a second book. And a few years ago, I was at a conference, a National Jewish Retreat, and a friend of mine, Rabbi Mendel Kalmanson, says to me, David, somebody needs to write a book on the previous Rebbe. Because in the lexicon of Chabad, he's called the previous Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneersohn, or the sixth Rebbe. And I said, you know what, Mendel, I really would like to write the book, but it's going to take an extensive amount of research. It's going to cost a large amount of money, because I'm going to have to hire researchers. I could, to write a light biography is one thing, but to do something of quality and do the proper research, you have to go into the archives in Russia. You have to go into the archives here in America. You have to travel. It's a complicated process, and it needed a lot of work. I need X amount of money. It was a large amount of money. And so the guy standing next to us, who is a Chabad supporter from the East Coast, who I happen to know because we once went to Israel together, he said, that's not a problem. And he funded the project. So I feel, number one, there was this kind of spiritual connection. There was intrigue. And then there was this divine providence that orchestrated when he said to me, that's not a problem. And then he wanted a proposal from me in writing, et cetera. And we did all of that. And he agreed to fund the project. And I was able to spend the time and hire the researchers to really do a quality job and to bring the Rebbe's life to light in a way that people would understand how, in a very chaotic period of Jewish history, he's a very pivotal figure.
Is there another biography of him?
There's no comprehensive biography in English. There's research material. There was many years ago in Hebrew, a book was written, but it was only drawing on classical Chabad sources and didn't use any other. It only used classical Chabad sources, and it was a very narrow narrative. There's been booklets here and there, but nobody's written a real comprehensive biography at all ever historically, and also not something that includes not just sources within the religious world, but to give historical context to his life, because we have to understand the playground or the arena that he is playing in. First things are, it's Russia, then into communism, then in Western Europe, and then the United States. We also have to understand the contemporary Jewish environment and what the challenges he had to face. So I drew on a lot of other historical sources which were outside of the Chabad world to paint that broad portrait of what his life was like and why it was so unique and remarkable.
Before we get into his life, which I want to talk about, I'm curious about the research process, because, I mean, did you actually go to Russia? Did you visit some of the places that he lived in? Yeah. Yes. What was that like? I mean, now I
had been to Russia already for my first book, The Secret of Chabad. I'd been there for 3 weeks, and Russia's a fascinating experience. People are a little wary about going to Russia, but it's quite safe. In a sense, we may not be in love with what Putin's doing in Ukraine. I've been in Ukraine twice in the last 2.5 years because Chabad is doing a lot of relief work in Ukraine. But in Russia, there's no permitted anti-Semitism. The government doesn't allow it. So I went to Russia for the second time to go to the places where the Rebbe lived. First thing, I went to the town of Lubavitch, where he was born, which is about 10 miles from the border in Belarus. Walked the town, felt the street, got the environment. And what's happening is Lubavitch was the capital of the Chabad movement for 102 years. It's a small little town with a few thousand residents. And they've been rebuilding the buildings that were destroyed because of war, et cetera, and so to speak, reclaiming those properties. So you're able to actually have a sense, what did the synagogue look like? What did the cemetery where the other Rebbes are buried, where it's located? You could actually see moments in history that we know about, that part of the Rebbe's life. So that was the first thing. The second thing, I went to Moscow. I went to St. Petersburg, the places in Russia he lived, and I went to and when he was exiled from Russia in 1927 after being sentenced to death, he was exiled to Riga. So I went to Riga, to Latvia, and you were able to see the aesthetics of a beautiful town and the apartment. And in St. Petersburg, I was able to get into the actual apartment where the Rebbe lived, because there's a residence there now. So I heard that somebody since then has purchased it in the Chabad community. And I went to the infamous Spolenka prison, where he was in prison, which is still used as a prison for political prisoners. And it's in the middle of a street, a regular street, but there's this prison right smack in the middle. And I had a tour guide who could speak both Russian and English. And I said, we have to go into the prison. She's looked at me like she's terrified. Nobody goes into Spolenka unless you go in, let's go one-way street. I said, we're going in. So I walked in, and I come to the so-called reception, bulletproof glass and the whole business. And I said, I'm from America. I'm doing research on a book. I need to see the cell where the Rebbe was held in 1927. She's petrified. She's shaking away because she can't believe I walked into the prison. I got an American passport. The Marines will save me. And they were not too happy that I turned up, and they basically told me they got to leave pretty quick. So I didn't get too deep into the prison, but I was able, and I also went to Rostov. That when the Germans invaded in 1915, and the Rebbe's father, who was the Fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Schneersohn, had to relocate to Rostov in southern Russia, and that's where he passed away in 1920, and that's where the previous Rebbe becomes Rebbe. And I went to Rostov to see the buildings and these yeshivas and the environment and the grave of his father. So you come out with a certain sense of the person when you understand the places that they live. And it gives you kind of, and you have to portray that, in the book, because you need to tell the story in a way that people get a sense of what is the real drama that happened here and what's the environment. It's not suburban California where we happen to live. It's a different kind of world.
Right.
Yeah.
So what was Lubavitch like in 1880 when the Frierdiker Rebbe was born? What was Lubavitch like?
Lubavitch was a town with about 1,700 residents in that day, the majority Jewish. Mm-hmm. It was also, it had been a little bit displaced, because until the train came through, the train line that went from Moscow, St. Petersburg, going out of Russia toward Western Europe. Lubavitch had been a very big market town, and it still was a market town. But when the train was being built by the Polakov brothers, which were two Jewish guys who were building the trains in Russia, and the third, they were connected a little to Chabad, and the third Rebbe said to them, listen, I don't want the train stopping in Lubavitch. This is an oasis of spirituality. This is a place that people come to get away from the physical world. So the train station is just about 10 miles away in a town called Rudnya, where people would get off the train and then they would make the trek to visit the Rebbe in the town of Lubavitch. So it was in the middle of an agricultural area, and a very beautiful kind of area. You have this town nestled on this town that's nestled. It was very basic in those days, but the point is, it was a spiritual kind of place of pilgrimage. People would come from all over Europe to come to visit the Rebbe, the different Rebbes that lived in Lubavitch. There were there was a series of Chabad Rebbes that lived in Lubavitch. And it really was, for 105 years, for over a century, it was the spiritual center of the Chabad movement. And the Lubavitcher Rebbes in Russia were from the most important rabbinical figures and the most influential Hasidic leaders. And so therefore, Lubavitch was also, another point is that from 1897, the great yeshiva was opened in Lubavitch, and it became a great academic center, because the yeshiva that was opened, which became an educational empire, which today we have over 50 branches of the Chabad yeshivas in the world, and both Rabbi Perlman and myself are products of that educational philosophy. and I'm serious when I do say it's better than Harvard, but that yeshiva was a yeshiva of great academic excellence in the town of Lubavitch. So there was scholarship, and there was Hasidic, there was rabbis that came there, and people would travel to Lubavitch to be in the atmosphere of the Rebbe and to absorb that sanctity and that holiness and to get away of the difficulties of their own life. They're living in a country with tremendous anti-Semitism, with economic deprivation. And suddenly they had this place to go to, which they could have a little sense of another experience that was uplifting and inspiring. And that was a remarkable place. Now there's no Jews that live there, but there's people that make the spiritual pilgrimage to go see Lubavitch.
Right. One of the interesting things that I found in the book was the description you made over a couple of chapters of the relationship between the sixth Chabad Rebbe, who the book is about, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, and his father, who was the previous Rebbe. And I did not really know much about that, honestly, growing up. I didn't hear much about it. And I feel like the fifth Rebbe is kind of a mystery. I don't know. I was very intrigued by the sort of distance he had from his son while they were growing up. It seems like he was away a lot. Do we know? I mean, you write in the book at one point, like, unfortunately, we lost a lot of the letters between father and son. But like, how much do we know about what the Rebbe
interesting dynamic.
The fifth Rebbe?
I'm saying the Rebbe Rashab traveled a lot.
Right.
I mean, for health purposes and to get away. It seemed that there were long periods of time that they were separated from each other. I believe that there was probably, when he was young, I mean, before the age of 10, there may be a year or two that he didn't see his father. That he lived primarily with his brother.
The fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Shalom Ber Schneersohn, we call him the Rebbe Rashab after his name. In Chabad, there's a tradition that we refer to different Rebbes with like a shortened version of their name. He born in 1860, passed away in 1920. Born in Lubavitch and passed away in the city of Rostov in southern Russia, where he's buried. And there's a remarkable story about his burial, which is really intriguing. But at 18 years old, they want to draft him. And he comes to be drafted, and the doctor turns to his brother and says, "Your brother's going to live another 3 months. He has tuberculosis. He has TB." And he gets an exemption from the army because of this. And then in 1883, his father, who was the fourth Rebbe, passes away, and he is not yet ready to accept the position of leadership of Chabad. He's only a young man. He's 22 years old. And he doesn't really want to accept that position of leadership. And during the next 10 years, we see the position of the town of Lubavitch going down from a point of view of prestige. Plus, his uncles had opened up competing Hasidic centers for Chabad. There was more than one Chabad Rebbe for a good period of decades, from the late 1860s all the way to almost the 20th century. And at that point, because of his health challenges, he is, listen, there's no great medical resources in the town of Lubavitch. And in Russia, there's also not so great medical resources. So he's got to go to Paris, he's got to go to Vienna, he's got to go to Germany. He's looking to try to turn around his medical situation. And we see, starting around 1893, at that period of time, he's much more in Lubavitch. But during that period of 10 years, his son is living with his grandmother a lot of the time. One time when his father came home and he was 4 years old, he didn't even know who his father was. So, because he had been away for a long, and it's not like today, you travel, you open the phone, you turn on WhatsApp, and you do a video call with your child who's in Swaziland. It's communication in those days was very, very difficult. But what happens after that, as the previous Rebbe begins to become close to Bar Mitzvah, is his father is now in Lubavitch. His medical situation must have improved. We don't know the details of his medical situation. It's all clouded in mystery. We don't have any medical records from over a century ago, almost a century and a half ago. We don't know about exactly what he did in different cities. And then he begins an intense period of mentorship of his son. He puts a tremendous amount of time and attention into his son. Every summer, from the time the previous Rebbe is 15, till he's like 21, 22, the fifth Rebbe goes off to a resort town called Bolivka, which is like 40 miles away. And during those summer months, he spends a lot of time studying with his son. And what's really going on here is one generation is mentoring the next. One generation is preparing the next for leadership. And because his son is going to have to succeed him at one day and is going to be facing unbelievable challenges. And we see the same thing happening between the previous Rebbe and the Rebbe. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneersohn, who's the son-in-law of the previous Rebbe, in the 30s, the previous Rebbe has serious health crisis. He spends between 1930 and 1939 2 years in medical care. And who's sitting at his side every day? His son-in-law. And what's going on at that point? And we see this from documents that we have, the same process of mentorship. So what the fifth Rebbe did for the sixth Rebbe, the sixth Rebbe did for the seventh Rebbe. This process of spiritual mentorship to prepare the next generation of leadership. It's a fascinating, interesting kind of multi-generational transmission of values. Very intriguing.
Yeah. Very.
Yeah. There's a lot of... He writes a lot about when he was young, very young, and his father was away. He was very close to the older Hasidim in Lubavitch, where he talks about the previous Rebbe, where he would go into the Beis Medrash and he would see, all those Hasidim that saw his grandfather and great grandfather, and he would sit there and just listen to them. And when he was 8, 9, 10 years old, did you find any?
No. What we see is more intriguing. Around that, his grandfather, who was the fourth Rebbe, passes away in his late 40s. So his grandmother becomes the grand matriarch of Lubavitch. In fact, the Chabad schools today all over the world are called Bet Rivka. They're named after her. And that grandmother's home she was like this grand dame of the Hasidic world. She was smart. She was articulate. She was respected as an elder. So when prominent rabbis would come to Lubavitch, where would they go? They would go to visit her, the Rebbetzin Rivka, the wife of the fourth Rebbe and the grandfather of Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, who is the point of this biography. Who was living in that house was him. He was 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And so who's coming there all the time? The greatest rabbis in all of Europe. The greatest, these towering spiritual personalities. And he, instead of going outside to play ball, is sitting and listening to their stories from 50 years ago and 100 years ago. And when he's a young man, he begins to write a diary. In fact, he even tells the story that his writing skills were very poor, and he went to a local guy who knew how to write in Russian and Yiddish, and he would write letters for the local nobles, and he got training in writing skills, and also I would imagine in syntax and how to write. And one of the things we see in the previous Rebbe, I guess when we read this in the original Hebrew, because he writes mostly in Hebrew, is he is a phenomenal writer. He is a poetic expression. I mean, if you were giving out the Pulitzer Prize for Hasidic writing, he would win it because the beauty of his writing is absolutely stunning. And he starts as a young man to document these stories that he heard from people that had seen Hasidim from generations before. And he creates this historiography, which he doesn't really reveal until he leaves Russia, by the way. And eventually that Hasidic historiography is today really one of the cultural icons of the Chabad world. Everybody knows those stories that he collected as a young man, and eventually begins publishing in the 1930s when he reaches late 1920s, early 1930s when he reaches Western Europe.
I'm embarrassed to say that I don't know this because I feel like I should as a Lubavitcher. But the Frierdiker Rebbe, the sixth Rebbe, wrote a journal, right, and diaries, and so we know a lot about his own thinking and his stories. Did the other Rebbes do that? I don't feel like the seventh, like the Rebbe didn't leave that over.
The Rebbe was much more verbal than writing. The Rebbe spoke maybe about 25,000 hours of Farbrengens throughout his career.
Right.
He wrote very little, the Rebbe, except for letters. And many of the letters were through Maskiris, through the secretaries, versus the Frierdiker Rebbe, which I think was on the flip side. He wrote much more. Like, for example, the Maimor, we're not going to get into this is not the purview of the study, but the Rebbe never wrote a Maimor.
Right.
The Frierdiker Rebbe wrote all of his Maimorim.
Right.
The Rebbe
he wrote later on because he had another problem. He wrote his Maimorim, his Hasidic discourses, but there's something else going on here, which is
he was a writer.
The difference between the two, which is like this: the Rebbe, the seventh Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Rebbe of our times, was a person who you never really had a sense Well, as one of the great figures of Chabad, Rabbi Yochanan told me one day that the Rebbe was an introvert that had to make himself into extrovert to become a Rebbe. The previous Rebbe is an extrovert from day one.
Right.
And we see something else. We see a tremendous amount of his inner world, his inner feelings, his anguish, his happiness, his joy, his challenges in life in the things that he writes in his diary and also in letters that he writes to other people. So what we have here, and this is probably, I think, what's the most unique aspect of this book. You have a lot of books that have been published in the last 25 years from all kinds of Jewish historians within the Orthodox tradition of great rabbinical figures. But we have almost none, I don't know of any other that we have a window into their internal spiritual worlds. We have a biography of the famous Chofetz Chaim, one of the great figures of Polish Jewry, of Reb Chaim Oizer Grudzinski, or more modern rabbinical figures that were very, very prominent and more well-known in the 20th century. But none of those biographies have any window into the inner worlds and spiritual struggles and anguish and happiness and joy of the person that they're writing about. This book tells us that why, not because I figured it out, because it's there. And so that world comes out.
When you say spiritual struggles, what do you mean? What do you mean by spiritual struggles?
Well, he writes as a young man about how he goes through a transformation of bar mitzvah. He writes about being in school and about the difficulties he has in the children. He writes about when he hits like after bar mitzvah, his father brings one of the most distinguished intellectual, spiritual Hasidim to become his teacher, and he becomes his primary teacher for the next couple of years. And he writes about his interactions with him and what he learned from him. So we see the development of, he writes about how he evolves from a young kid and he matures and grows and develops. And we have him talking about this he's talking about this. It's not that, we found something, hidden. It's been published before, but in 3,000 different places. And what I did was go through all the original material and take that into a narrative. So when he writes about that his father's away and he's in school as a child, he says, my parents are away. I've got a teacher that beats me up and I got friends that are not so great. He's writing about his experience as an 8, 9, 10-year-old. It could have been anything. And that's something we've never seen before by such a towering Hasidic personality. And he's a very self-expressive person. So, or later on in life, in the 1940s, he's in America trying to rekindle Judaism in America. He's trying to change the direction of American Jewry. He writes a letter about his frustration that I came from Poland. That was he had escaped the Nazis in a remarkable story. He says, I came from Poland, which is a place rich with spirituality, with Torah, with scholarship. And here I am in an icy cold place. And I'm trying to get my Hasidim to go along with me because he's trying to change American Jewry. And there's not too many of them that are listening to me. And he's very frustrated. He writes about his frustration. That's what we have here. Mm-hmm. And this is all in the public domain. It's all been there, but you have to go through thousands of letters and a tremendous amount of material, put it together into a narrative style.
You are I'm just going to ask my father a question, because you have been learning through his works, right? Have you discovered something you didn't know before? Or do you feel closer to him now? Or
I grew up in Montreal, like Rabbi Eliezrie, where we had teachers that were his chassidim.
Right.
I mean, the teachers that taught us were students of the previous Rebbe that were sent to Montreal in 1942.
Right.
So they talked a lot about him. But we, as the younger generation, we always we had a Rebbe. When we grew up, we had a Rebbe, and that's the way it always was. You don't have two kings. Right. Freak Rebbe was great. Only in the sense because the Rebbe made him so great. Right. I mean, the Rebbe, every Farbrengen, we'll talk about the Rebbe, the Shver, the leader of the generation. But to us, it was the Rebbe, and that was it.
Distant,
and then that was it. I was one of the last few people to see Shlomo Aaron Kazanovsky alive in the hospital in Boston. And I spent some time with him, and he would tell me stories of his interaction with the Frierdiker Rebbe. He would not call him the Frierdiker Rebbe. He would say the Rebbe.
Right.
And he would chuckle and he would say, to you, the Frierdiker Rebbe. Right. So that's how we grew up. We grew up with there's a Rebbe, and the Rebbe is the Rebbe, and the Frierdiker Rebbe, that's the oil. That's where you go, like Rabbi Eliezrie said before. That's where we go in your Shvat. We do it. But we didn't know much.
The Rebbe said something very intriguing. The Rebbe himself said something very intriguing, which is and this is in a book that Rabbi Groner published, who was a secretary, that he once said to Rabbi Groner, he says, I never had the problem of transitioning from one Rebbe to another. He never met the fifth Rebbe. All he did has an encounter with the sixth Rebbe. So the Rebbe's talking about his own spiritual. He said, I never had to have two Rebbes. So there was a transition, and for some Hasidim that was difficult. But I want to tell you something interesting about Montreal, which is...
Right.
No, because Montreal is a very interesting...
Go ahead, because I want to ask you something about...
Yeah, ask away.
So what I'm reading, when you're reading through his Achraynis, or the Likutei Deburim, his diary, I find that he was very, in America, he was very, very, like you had mentioned before, very uncomfortable. He just couldn't find his place. He had come from a place in Russia where, Chassidim were Chassidim, and there was warmth, like you described before. He went to Poland, which had its own challenges. He was not universally loved in Poland. I mean, my mother is a Ger Chassid through and through. When he came into Poland, like you explained before, Judaism was already mature. Polish Jewry was living there since the 14th century. There was tremendous amount of scholarship going on. So he had his own challenges in Poland. But I found in America, he just couldn't find his place where... he came here, he established Lubavitch, but he just, over his letters and his Farbrengens over and over, like you said before, he was just so frustrated that not only American Jewry was not listening to him, but even his own Hasidim lacked the warmth of davening. He was a European. He was a European by nature. What would you say about that? What do you say to that?
I want to divide the three times periods of history. In 1927, the Rebbe is arrested because of his activities to keep Judaism alive in Russia, sentenced to death, and eventually he gets exiled and he goes to Riga. What does he do at that point? He's got a dilemma.
So let me ask you a question. Can I ask you a question about that? Before you go there, could you explain, like in 1927, before he leaves, how many Hasidim, do you have any idea how many Hasidim there were in Russia? Or
first thing you have to understand,
is there like kind of a feeling?
There was different kinds of Hasidim in Russia. I don't know what the number of Hasidim was, and don't forget the Hasidim were suffering terribly from communism, and you had many Hasidim that they were good Hasidim, and their children were being affected by communism. But I think there was also a tremendous amount of Jews in Russia that they would say, "Oh, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, that's the spiritual leader of Russian Jewry." But I want to parse on. I want to focus here on something different. When the Rebbe is thrown out of Russia in 1927, he comes to Riga and he's got to reinvent Chabad in Western Europe. And one of the things he does, that's when he begins publishing all the stories. He's creating this historiography because he's trying to give people who have come from Chabad backgrounds and ones not from Chabad backgrounds, their story. Everybody has a story in life. You have a grandmother, everybody has got their story. He's got to create a story and identity for people that are going to connect to Chabad. So that's period number one. Number two, when he becomes to Poland, he's got a very big problem. Because Poland, you've got tremendous Hasidic groups. You've got the Ger Rebbe, the Belzer Rebbe, the Rabdomsker, and you've got great yeshivas like Chachmei Lublin and towering people like Rabbi Meir Shapiro. And he comes in, he's got like 14 Hasidim, and he starts from scratch. And he's got to reinvent himself, and he creates a network of yeshivas that becomes academic excellence in Poland. And he has opposition, because number one, he doesn't want to play politics, because the major place that the religious world unifies with is either the modern Orthodox or religious Zionists or Mizrahi, and the more Haredi are Gouda. And the Rebbe says, I have nothing to do with political parties. So he's an individualist. He doesn't go along with the flow, and it creates a certain degree of tension between him and the other leaders in the country. But when he comes to America, he's also going through he's trying to change the direction of American Jewry, which is a revolutionary thing, because he's also facing the awareness of the Holocaust, losing millions of Jews. He doesn't have the financial resources he wants to have to be transformational in this country and to continue to help the Jews in Russia. He's very struggling always on the financial level, and his group of Hasidim here are very small. It begins with just a few, and he's trying to build up, and it's very, very difficult. So he faces here a tremendous, it's not easy. But at the same time, when you think about it, what I think is one of the most intriguing things about the previous Rebbe is
we can't hear you. We can't hear you, David.
Did you knock something?
He reinvents himself.
Oh.
Yeah. He reinvents himself.
We don't hear you. Something happened.
Can you hear me now?
Wait, we got it.
We got you now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, now, so what happens in each historical setting, he reinvents himself. He comes to America, and many other great rabbinical scholars come to America, but they still think they're in Europe. He is able to adapt himself to the American reality in a remarkable kind of way. He understands the lay of the land. He knows what's going on over here. He creates programs like Release Time. Who would think about public school children? He is, in addition to him trying to save the Jews in Europe, and he doesn't have much political power and he doesn't have much money, trying to save his students in the yeshivas and trying to help people as much as he can, he's also trying to reimagine and transform American Judaism. And he does it he doesn't do it like in a very singular way. I'm going to make a yeshiva like I had in Poland and I'll have 14 students in the yeshiva. He says, no, I'm going after everybody. I'm going to go after the kid who's in public school, who's never going to walk into a shul, and I'm going to make a program once a week to teach him a little bit about Judaism. I'm going to go to the kid who doesn't want to go to a Jewish day school, and I'll make a Hebrew school. And I go to the kid who wants to go to a day school, and I'll make him a Jewish day school, which itself is transformational because in Europe, the more traditional community didn't want to have schools that integrated secular and religious education. He's adapting to the reality of America. But his frustration is he has very few real followers. He doesn't have the financial resources. He's medically extremely handicapped. But nevertheless, what he does in the last decade of his life in America and beyond is really revolutionary. And we see the impact of that till today. And one of the most interesting examples is Montreal. Because what he does in Montreal is revolutionary. Right. Because what happens in Montreal is he gets a group of 9 Chabad students who are saved from Shanghai, and they're not in 1942. It's the beginning of it. It's September of 1941. They come to Montreal. At that point, he has a small yeshiva in New York, and he could say, you know what, I'll bring these 9 guys and I'll bolster my yeshiva. He says, no way, I'm going to change Montreal Jewry. There wasn't one Orthodox day school in Montreal. The only schools were Yiddishist schools, schooled by the secular elements. And he says, I'm changing Judaism in the city. And if you look at Montreal today, it's one of the great traditional cities in North America. And the beginning of that is the work that he did starting in the 1940s. He's a visionary person. He thinks out of the box. He thinks big. He wants to change things. And he says, and he tells his students, you're going to go there. And he tells them, no, I don't want you just to learn. I want you to change the city. And he does it. That's an act of a visionary leader.
That's true. Was there
neither of us would be sitting here today, but we would not be sitting here today if he didn't do that yeshiva in Montreal.
That's for sure. There's nothing to talk about.
True.
Was there ever a thought in his mind of going to Palestine versus America when he was leaving Europe during World War II? Did he? Because he visited.
Not when he was leaving Europe. Once in the mid. So let me give you the historical background. There is a time that I think it was considered around 1935, but he didn't go to Eretz Yisrael. But I want to tell you, his plan to come to America was different.
Because he did visit Israel. He did. He was in Israel and toured
Israel
and
in 1929.
saw Israel. Right,
but he went for really.
So was there ever?
He went for. I don't know if he ever seriously considered moving to Eretz Yisrael, to Israel at the time. At that time, there was no state of Israel. It was just the land of Israel. It was in the 30s. But I think in the mid-1930s, it was an idea that was floated but never went anywhere. But we need to dig a little deeper about him coming to America, because that is the interesting untold story. Because what happens is like this. On the Saturday, the war breaks out. World War II breaks out September 1st, 1939. The Saturday night before, a group of students had come from America to attend the yeshiva in Poland. It was a town on the outskirts of Warsaw. Was a suburb called Otwocka, and that's where the Rebbe's yeshiva was. And the leader of Chabad in America at the time was a man called Yisrael Jacobson. And on Saturday night, he goes in to meet with the Rebbe, and the Rebbe tells him this. He says, I've been thinking about moving to America for a long time. He had been in the United States in 1929 for about a year. to visit here in the United States, to raise money for Russian Jewry, to strengthen Judaism, for a host of different reasons. His visit was a remarkable, successful visit, successful and had some challenges to it. He didn't raise as much money as he wanted to, but he had a very big impact. But now it's 10 years later, and he tells Jacobson, listen, I want to come to America. My question was, could I make a yeshiva in America like I have here in Europe? Because the apple of his eye, the most important responsibility his father gave to him was the yeshiva. And he felt that was one of the central missions of his life. He says, I see from the American students that you brought here, because there was a group that came earlier, it's possible. The Americans aren't that pampered. They can handle it. And I asked some of the Hasidim in America, and they assured me that I can do it. So I want to come to America, but I don't want to do what I did 10 years ago, that I got involved with all kinds of broad community issues. I don't want to get in. I want to just be a Rebbe. His words were, I want to be a Rebbe for Hasidim and not a Rebbe for the whole world. He basically wants, he's going into, he calls it sabbatical years. He's going to be 60 years old. He's in a wheelchair. He's got serious medical challenges. And he says, you know what? I'm going to slow down. I want to focus on my own community. I want to take care of them. And I want to have a more, and he writes in his diaries or whatever, that he yearns to be in the tent of Torah. He wants to be in a spiritual environment, a little free of all the tremendous things. That's September 1939. Which doesn't sound like
America. Which is not
March
America.
1940. Sure. He gets off the boat. They wheel him off the boat in a wheelchair. And on the bottom of the gangway, a reporter walks over to him. And he asks him, why, in Yiddish, was did the Rebbe gekommen in America? Why did the Rebbe come to America? And the Rebbe looks him in the eye. He's sitting in the wheelchair, wearing a shtreimel, which he's celebrating as coming to America. He always spoke about America as a great country. And he says, gekommen machen America makom Torah. I came to make America a place of Torah. The reporter is incredulous because Orthodoxy is withdrawing, it's shrinking. There's a little core of people here. It's insecure. There's a yeshiva Torah Vadas, there's yeshiva university, but it's not the center of scholarship. It's not the center of spirituality. And people did pioneer Judaism, but it's like a small group of people holding on for dear life and holding on for dear life. And he turns to the reporter and he says to him, I'm going to do that. And the guy looks at him and says, are you serious? He says, hair will grow on my palm before you make America into a place of Jewish scholarship. And the Rebbe pushes himself up from the wheelchair. And he says to him those words, America is nicht anders. America is not different. America is not different. We're going to make it into a place of Torah. And so one of the students of the yeshiva Torah Vadas, which was really the mother yeshiva of America, Herschel Fogelman, who eventually transferred to the Rebbe's yeshiva, and he gets sent by the previous Rebbe to make a school in Worcester. He said to me like this. He said, we felt, talking about how religious Jews felt at that moment in America, we felt like a wagon train on the prairie surrounded by the Indians. They're like holding on for dear life. Because if you looked around, like 20% of American Jews were going to Hebrew schools. 20% were going to synagogue. Anybody interested was going off to reform and conservative. Orthodoxy's falling apart. As the great Jewish sociologist Marshall Sclair said, Orthodox Judaism was a case study in institutional decay. It's just literally falling apart. He says, we felt like we were in a wagon train on the prairie, surrounded by the Indians. And the Rebbe came like the U.S. Cavalry, and he didn't want to just chase off the Indians. He wanted to conquer the whole continent. This is his mindset. So in the beginning, a week before the war, 5 days before the war, he wants to come to America to slow down, take it easy, be in an atmosphere of Jewish scholarship and spirituality, and just focus on his group of Hasidim. And now he gets off the boat and he says, I'm changing the whole country. And we see till today the impact of that vision, because none of us would be sitting here today if he didn't have that impact. It didn't have that vision then. It's a transformational moment in American Jewish history.
You think that if you were sitting here with other Orthodox rabbis, they would agree with you on that? They would
100%.
Agree with you on that. They would say, why did he have more of an impact than Aaron Kotler had, or Rabbi
Because I'll tell you the reason why.
Soloveitchik had.
There's no question that Aaron Kotler, Orthodoxy in America, you could say, is based into three large groups: the Haredi yeshiva world, the Chabad world, and the more modern Orthodox yeshiva and worship world. Right. I would argue, very interesting, that Lakewood and the work of Rabbi Aaron Kotler is a tremendous success in building a great center of Jewish scholarship. But it's a fortress of Torah, which has very little impact beyond that immediate community. Is it a phenomenal accomplishment? Without question. Is it one of the greatest centers historically of Jewish learning? Without question. Is it in New Orleans, Louisiana, in Yorba Linda, California, in Long Beach, California? Does that have much influence over Jewish destiny?
Yes, they would say to you, yes. They are now Misnagdim in St. Louis. There's Misnagdim all over the place. They would say to you.
You are correct, but what they're doing there is they're replicating the same process of building a small kind of fortress of Judaism, which has a minimal effect over the rest of the community. They're doing good things.
And everybody agrees there's nothing like Chabad with the outreach work. We agree.
No,
but I'm just saying when you say forcefully that without Lubavitch, American Orthodox Jewry would have ceased to exist.
No,
they would argue with you.
I mean,
there was already here. The Satmars came and introduced all different things after the war. Other Hasidim came here.
No, all of these things are true.
Yes, Lubavitch has a unique place. Yes.
No, but I'm arguing a bigger argument.
They would not.
They created, what they did was much like the U.S. Cavalry. They created a fort on the prairie, but the world surrounding around them was different. And I would argue that the Rebbe was concerned with the welfare of every single Jew, and so therefore his influence is transformative in the whole Jewish, all of American Judaism. And you can hardly find a Jew today who doesn't have a Chabad story. So did they succeed in doing what they intended? And by the way, I would even argue further. If you look what happened in Russia in the 1920s, all the great yeshivas, including Rabbi Aaron Kotler, Mr. Zalman Meltzer, the Chofetz Chaim, who, by the way, regretted it later in his life. He said, I should not have left Russia. But they leave Russia to protect the core of their students because they feel there's no future for Judaism in Russia, and they want to protect those scholars. And there's an historical precedent for that. The famous story of Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai, after the destruction of the temple, he creates a center of learning in the town of Yavne. The Rebbe comes along in Russia, and he says, I'm not leaving. I'm responsible for the welfare of every single Jew. I'm going to make a network of schools, which is going to keep Judaism alive in synagogues and whatever it may be needed, mikvahs, whatever is needed to keep Judaism alive in Russia. And that system lasts underground until the fall of the Soviet Union. Fast forward to 1940. It's the same debate. It's a debate between responsibility for everybody or we're protecting the core. It's two different strategies in Jewish survival. Both of them succeeded in their own ways, but the strategy of survival of the core basically protects that core. It doesn't change the whole Jewish destiny. And I would argue that the Rebbe's approach is validated by history because we see the trickle-down effect of Chabad into all aspects of the Jewish community today. And most interesting, I'll even add this. The Jewish Federations in North America just did a study about how Jews are reconnecting to Judaism since October 7th. They're calling it the surge. The largest number of people are going where? Not to Reform, not to JCCs, not to conservative congregations, not to Orthodox, and for sure not to Lakewood. The largest number of people are using Chabad as their avenue of connection to Judaism. And those are figures from the liberal Jewish establishment, which shows you that the previous Rebbe's strategy of taking care of responsibility for all Jews, it's a different strategy. One is we'll protect the core. The other one is we're taking responsibility for everybody. It played out in Russia and it played out in America.
Okay, I want to make 3 quick points, okay? First of all, you write a beautiful scene I thought was extremely heartbreaking in the book, the scene when the Frierdiker Rebbe leaves Russia and the Hasidim are at the train station and they're watching him leave and everybody's crying. And you quote, I think, Zalman Duchman and some other people. I found that scene, I choked up because that must have been extremely painful for the Hasidim, but I can imagine for the Rebbe himself, it was, leaving the flock behind. I don't know. I was very, I really felt for him in that moment. And
he writes about it trailing. Now, when he leaves Russia,
he writes himself about that in his
letter on the train.
Terrible.
He writes a letter on the train, a heartbreaking letter that he's forced to leave Russia. And later on, it's very interesting. There's one of the Chabad followers comes to him in Riga, where he's in exile, and he comes to the Rebbe and he says, "Rebbe, you're not happy. Like, what's going on? And he says, I left Russia. I left my people.
Yeah.
I left my community. He feels tremendously. He has no choice. If he doesn't leave Russia, they're going to kill him. There's no question. There's two choices here. It's either death or leaving Russia. And the fact that he was able to leave Russia is another whole story in itself, and a miraculous story about how he gets out of Russia. But because the Russian government doesn't want to let him go, there's a tremendous battle about it. But he is not happy about this exile. And he sees his different exiles. He's being forced out of Russia, forced out of the town of Lubavitch, forced out of Russia, forced out of Europe. He has to come to the United States as orchestration of divine providence, which give him every time a new mission in life. And so he's heartbroken, and he writes about it. And his secretary, interestingly, Chacha Fagan, writes about the Rebbe in Riga that he's very unhappy because he doesn't have the people to talk to. He's very upset about what's going on in Russia. He's very anguished over the fate of his of the Jews of Russia, and he's deeply troubled in that early period that he's in Riga after he leaves Russia.
Wow.
No, it's
very.
No, when you talk about it, I'm getting all. I'm just thinking about it, how what it's like. I mean, it's for him. This is where he was.
I know.
This is where his father, his people, his father was the Rebbe there. His grandfather was the Rebbe there. Goes back to the Alter Rebbe.
Yeah.
This was their place, and all of a sudden, boom, he's out of his milieu. He's out of his comfort zone.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
terrible.
It's horrible.
Yeah, but it's more than that. He feels a responsibility for every Jew in Russia. He doesn't want to leave because at the very core of who he knows what the
Okay. The other thing I wanted to mention, and we touched on it for a second, but I wouldn't be me if I didn't bring it up again. And it's about women. I think the way you describe the Friedrich Rebbe's wife, how strong she was, how much she was involved in all of everything he went through, his daughters, his wife, his mother. It's really interesting because I think a lot of people have a perception about Hasidic sects or Hasidim in general that, the men are on the forefront and the women are sort of like side characters. And it's really actually not like that at all. And I think it's really beautiful to read the stories of how much they were partners in every single way, everything they did. I mean, even when he's exiled, his daughter, the Rebbe's wife, who's the Rebbe we're talking about in this book's daughter, she goes with him into exile, right? Like the women are such a central part of the story. And I'm hoping Rabbi Eliezrie will write a book one day just on the women, because that would be really interesting.
Well, his confidant in many ways is his wife. And when he's visiting in America for 1 year in 1929, he writes her almost on a daily basis, and we have some. I was able through a connection in the Russian government sees those letters; they're in their possession, and through a connection, I was able to get some of those letters that he wrote, which are very personal, and they're very interesting because they show he's writing to his wife his inner feelings. They were seized by the Russian government, but there's something else also about the women which is interesting, which is there's other Hasidic groups. And the way that women see themselves is they are married to a chassid. In Chabad, the woman is a chassid in her own rights. And one of the things the Rebbe begins to do in the 1930s, and he speaks about it should have been done even earlier, is to begin advocating for the study of Hasidic philosophy by women. In other words, he encourages very strongly to organize a women's organization, but not the women's organization that's going to make cookies and going to make cake and going to make a better kugel on Shabbos. What?
Right.
Right. Perlman is dreaming about the kugel, but we're talking about women who are going to get involved with Jewish
about the women's organization in Montreal that used to put on the annual bazaar.
Yeah.
That was the mothers of the yeshiva. They would put on an annual bazaar, raise money.
He wants women.
I think they made $47.
Yeah, 47. But he wants women who are going to become knowledgeable. He was surrounded by Jewish learning and masters.
Think about it.
And masters of Hasidic philosophy. And he does something very interesting. In the United States and in Europe, he takes the most distinguished Hasidim, Not the guy, the third level guy, but the most respected scholars in the Hasidic world. And he says, I want them to be the mentors to the women. He wants to uplift the women intellectually. And he takes the most. So it's not like he says, okay, we're going to find some guy who's not so special. No, we're going to take the most respected scholars in the Hasidic world, and they're going to teach the women. And then something very interesting happens in 1940. The Rebbe escapes from Poland, which is a story which you could write. It could be a Hollywood movie. The American government goes to the German government to save the Rebbe. But I want to tell you what happens in Riga. He comes to Riga. This is the interesting story. He comes to Riga before he comes to the United States, because he goes from Poland to Latvia, and for Latvia, he heads to the United States. He's in Riga for 2-3 months waiting to get the American visas and things like that. And during that period of time, a group of teenage girls, 18, 19-year-old girls, come to meet with the Rebbe. And I'll say it in Yiddish and translate it afterwards. And they chazer ha-maimer. The girls repeat by heart a Hasidic discourse. Now, historically, the only ones who did this were yeshiva students. So now he's putting these young women on the level of rabbinical students. And imagine how intimidating it is. You're 18 years old, and in front of the Rebbe, you are repeating by heart a Hasidic discourse that he taught, which is a deep philosophical, esoteric teaching of Jewish mysticism. It's really a profound treatise on Jewish on spiritual ideas. And you are repeating it in front of the Rebbe, and he's listening to you, and maybe throwing a few words here and there. And different girls are repeating different chapters. Think of the moment of empowerment to these women, intellectual and spiritual empowerment, where they're giving this validation. What could be greater for a Hasidic woman than to say a mimer in front of the Rebbe? It would be, to me, I'd be terrified, 18-year-old kid, to say a mimer, to repeat a Hasidic discourse in front of Rebbe. An 18-year-old girl. Right. This is empowerment. This is revolutionary. Right. So he sees women as having a leadership role.
So where could we get your book?
Hold it. Before we do that, okay. I don't want to give the pitch yet, but I want him to tell the story of how the Frierdiker Rebbe, I know it's a long story, got out of Nazi Germany. It's an incredible story. Rabbi Eliezrie, can you just tell it in short, because we just don't have time for the whole story.
In brief and short, the war breaks out, and the Rebbe is an Otvotsky. He's a Latvian citizen because he had lived in Latvia for a while. And he goes to Warsaw, and the war is going on, and the Germans are invading and everything else like this. And the Hasidim, the Chabad in America at that point is a tiny group of a few hundred people with no political clout and no power and no influence. But somehow they get, I can tell you with all the gory details, there was involvement of Justice Brandeis from the Supreme Court. There was a famous political appointee called Benjamin Cohen who worked in the White House, who was a very assimilated Jew, but for some reason he was a key player. And what happens is that the American government goes to the elements of the German government. Don't you have to realize this is October, December 1939. America doesn't enter the war to December of 41. And many people think that they're not going to conquer more than Poland. The war is going to end at this point. They got Poland. That's it. They're not going to go conquer France. And so Germany is very interesting in being in the good graces of the United States because America is still neutral and they don't want America to enter in the war. And even though the war had started, England had not sent troops to defend Poland. So a lot of people think the war is going to end at this point. So what happens is the American government goes to elements in the German government and they say, we want you to save this rabbi. And they say, okay. And the Abwehr, which is the naval intelligence headed by Admiral Canaris, who was, he had a very independent-minded person, and he had some soldiers that were working for him that had Jewish background. He sends the soldiers to Warsaw to find the Rebbe, and they have to, and they're looking for him, but they don't know where he is. And this goes on for about a month or two. And finally, he's discovered, and a group of German soldiers escort him to Berlin, and from Berlin to Latvia, and from there he comes to America. So what happens is he goes through the bombings.
Imagine he's driving in a car with the Nazis.
Right.
Okay, it's not normal.
Right.
The Nazis and the commander, the lieutenant colonel, who was a man called Ernst Bloch, whose father was Jewish, but he had been Aryanized. Aryanized is when Hitler recognized you as an Aryan. His mother, I actually spoke to his granddaughter some time ago, and imagine you come to a Berlin train station, you're surrounded by a unit of German soldiers, a bunch of rabbis, and then the SS is saying, what are you doing? And there's a confrontation more than once between the SS, because the SS would like to kill the Rebbe. And so you got the SS looking for him, the Wehrmacht looking to save him, and eventually he comes to the United States. And he's saved here. The story has a tremendous amount more detail to it.
I mean, there is a phenomenal
book story of collaboration. And there was even a movie on Israeli television.
This is the hand of Hashem, literally the hand of Hashem taking the Rebbe from Europe to America. It doesn't make any sense because
amazing.
By the way, when he came to America. I just want to finish with this. When he came to America, it touched a real chord here because he was the first major rabbinical figure to escape from Nazi Europe.
Right. When can we buy the book?
Yeah.
Where?
You can buy the book today.
Where and when?
You can buy it on Amazon today. You can pre-order the book. It's being published on November 4th. The book is going to be out in all the Jewish bookstores. And hopefully, I mean, there's not too many other good bookstores around lately. One of the tragedies of modern times is the loss of bookstores. I'm a big lover of bookstores. I like to go into bookstores and browse around. And, it's interesting to go see beautiful bookstores. But the book is on Amazon. The book is Undaunted, published by Koren. And we're going to be doing a very serious book tour. I've already got over 20 cities lined up. I'm going to be going to South Africa in June, and Australia a little at the end of June, beginning of June, South Africa, and afterwards Australia. And I'll be going to London in January. We got a whole series of places we're going to be going. It's going to be a very interesting experience. We're going to have going to meet Jewish communities all over the country and all over the world, and to tell this story, which I think is a remarkable story of such courage and also such chaos, because his life is from Tsarist Russia to communism, to Poland, Western Europe, and then to American freedom and opportunity. He changes himself time and again, and he emerges as one of the most transformational figures in 20th century Jewry.
Well,
he had
Mazel Tov on this accomplishment.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
The two of us definitely feel we understand what it takes to write a book, because we've tried 100 times and we've written one sentence. So,
not even
half a sentence.
We have a word. We have a word.
So we really congratulate you and much success on it.
Good luck. It was a great
Thank
having
you very much.
David.
It's been a very interesting experience. And what I'm hoping and praying is that by telling this story, number one, we'll have a much better, it'll put the Rebbe on the historical pedestal where he deserves to be. But beyond that, I think it's an inspirational story to all of us. When you talk about anti-Semitism today, he met that challenge. When he talked about the future of the Jewish people, he had a strategy to meet that challenge. When you talk about the difficulties we have in our own lives, and we see how he dealt with so many difficulties in his life, it becomes an inspiration to us about how we also can grow and develop and to do unbelievable things in this world.
It's true.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, David. Talk to you soon.